This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, I'm sharing with you some of the top regrets from retirees. This is from both surveys and research, as well as from my own experience over the last 17 years working with my own clients who have shared their varied regrets, both financially and otherwise, as they plan and save and invest for retirement. So today I'm talking about the most frequently cited concern during retirement identified by more than half of retirees, and that is inflation. So according to the 2022 Retiree Reflections Survey from the Employee Benefit Research Institute, about 54% of retirees said that they were concerned, the most often concerned that they cited was inflation. And that makes sense because inflation is the silent killer. It eats away at your purchasing power and the real money that you have to spend, especially in retirement when you're no longer working. And the pot of money that you have starting in retirement, we have to be careful about making sure that that can grow and keep up with inflation so that you don't have this reduction in lifestyle or have to make big sweeping changes later on because you didn't plan for it. Now, the problem, though, with ignoring inflation, which is what many people do, is that aside from the last few years where we really did notice inflation spike, when you have things that are increasing by 8-9% a year, and in some cases, depending on what you were looking to buy, there was crazy amounts of inflation, 25% increase in 1 year in the price of whatever. A lot of that, I remember we were putting a fence in and I was like, what does this thing cost? But inflation that is often ignored because prices, except for in 2021, when it was really bad, most often inflation, it creeps up, prices creep up by 1, 2, 3% a year, and enough to not really notice it much. And also for the last 15 years prior to COVID, inflation was historically low by the norms if you go back several decades. Right up until COVID, inflation was pretty low. So we haven't really been paying much attention to it until the last couple of years when it reared its ugly head again. But if you ignore inflation, both in your working years and when you're planning for retirement, that ends up causing a lot of remorse and more insecurity about the future if you fast forward into retirement. A couple of common problems I see when people don't consider the silent killer of inflation is one is they're too conservatively invested. This happens in both their working years. Maybe you're holding too much in cash. You're not paying attention to how you're invested. You're not intentionally trying to let time help you to maximize your growth. When you're working, time is on your side. Even if you're 5 years out from retirement, I'm not suggesting you're 100% in stocks and just go for broke, but you do want to try to maximize growth to the extent that that is prudent. I also see a lot of people really hunker down and they want to be really conservatively invested in retirement to try to protect what they have. But it ends up having the opposite effect when you fast forward 10, 15, 20, 25 years. If you're too conservatively invested and you're only making maybe 3% or 4% a year, you're actually losing money. And then the other problem I see is that because they're not anticipating inflation's bite in retirement, they're not saving enough money in their working years. And the result is that you just don't have enough assets that you've accumulated in retirement, either through being too conservatively invested or by not investing enough money to begin with. And so if you don't have enough assets accumulated in retirement to last and keep pace with inflation, that's where we start to run into problems. Now, I just want to illustrate this with an example. So if you go back to basically the last 100 years or so, now it varies somewhat, but on average, the return of the stock market averaged about 10% a year. Bonds returned about 5 to 6%, and cash, the returns on cash were somewhere in the range of 3 to 4%. What matters, though, is your after-tax real rate of return. So in other words, what is your rate of return on average after you pay taxes and after inflation? And the sad reality is that if you were ultra conservatively invested and you put everything in cash, and I'm not even saying like under the mattress, like this is like cash, savings account, money markets, short-term CDs, you made about 3 to 4% a year. After inflation, that return over the last 100 years or so is cut to about a half or 1% a year. And after taxes, now we're in negative territory. So your real rate of return is you are actually losing money every single year if you stay ultra conservative in cash or cash like investments. In bonds, it's actually not much better. You made 5-6% before taxes and before inflation per year. But after inflation, again, that gets cut in half. Now you're at maybe 2.5%, 3%. And after taxes and inflation, you're at like 0.5% or 1% a year. So you're barely keeping pace if you are invested in bonds. Stocks is the only category among the three where you had a very positive real after tax rate of return of around 5%. Now, I'm not suggesting that you invest everything in the stock market, but having a stock component of the portfolio, at least 30% if you're ultra conservative, but 40, 50% or higher is prudent for most retirees. And so that having that target of that amount of stocks will help you keep pace with inflation over a long period of time. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.